Welcome to Antidote Radio. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth Kushel.
Hey, so Jeremy, we've this week a lot has this is actually a perfect topic to start off with because as a result of some of the legal issues that were going on in terms of the court case, and I don't know if you wanted to give a quick update on that or not.
Well, I am not under indictment anymore, and
Fantastic.
Both of my charges have been dismissed. There's some contention in an internal fashion about my second charge being described as dismissed as a diversion. Internally, that's what the prosecutor is stating it as, but there was never any deal. I've never changed my not guilty plea. And so I took a little bit of a semi-public attention vacation this week, and just I felt my mind and heart become a little bit unburdened. I took a little bit of a break. So I'm sorry. I feel like I haven't really done my homework this week, and so I'm hoping you will lead us through the important things that happened this week. And I appreciate your work out there, Greg.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'll do what I can. And that's great news, by the way, that that now that finally we're starting to move forward in a positive way with this court case, which has been so time consuming. And but we know that we were in the right, and that what happened there was clearly a violation of our rights. And so we'll continue to come out in the future. But anyways, I'm glad that it seems that this burden is finally being lifted off your shoulders here. That's a positive sign in the right direction for sure. I'll do the best I can. A lot of times I feel like, well, I'm not doing enough to keep up with the so-called news. Always got to put the news in quotations because you never know anymore which sources you can actually trust. But as I was saying, though, we actually ended off. We were in the midst of a conversation about Iran and what's going on with some of the folks within the administration, particularly the last-minute battle that Trump waged against Rex Tillerson, and particularly Rex Tillerson, but also H.R. McMaster and General James Mattis over whether or not to recertify the Iran deal and renew it for another 90 days or however long the period is. And Trump was very much against this, along with Steve Bannon and Sebastian Gorka. And so we ended the show last week talking about this, but this is actually a perfect way to open the show this week, because there have been some developments in this whole matter this week, and the developments center around particularly an article, or I believe it was actually a Facebook post by Carolyn Glick, who we've talked about. I think we've mentioned her before. She is the deputy managing editor of the Jerusalem Post, and she's also has a position with Frank Gaffney's Center for Security Policy. I forget the title, but she's also the director of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. There's an Orwellian name if there ever was one. The David Horowitz Freedom Center's Israel Project chairperson.
Does Glick have a relationship with Meirav Wormser in some type of organization? I feel like it's vaguely reminiscent.
That wouldn't surprise me, because the Wormsers, I believe Meirav Wormser didn't she help finance some of those anti-Islam films, propaganda films? I'm not positive. I'd have to look that up. I could maybe take a minute to look that up here in a minute, but I'm not positive. That's a good question. It wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, definitely wouldn't surprise me. I think that there's a lot of connections in there. So yeah, I'd have to check that out. But anyway, Glick in this Facebook article wrote that H.R. McMaster is on a purge against people opposed to the Iran deal within the Trump administration, and most of these figures are particularly close to Steve Bannon. They were also close to General Michael Flynn, such as Ezra Cohen-Watnick, who we've talked about, who was instrumental in, I believe, debunking one of the congressional investigations about something regarding Russia. The details escape me at the moment, but the point is, Cohen-Watnick and several other these NSA officials within the intelligence community that have been brought in by Trump and Bannon have been Carolyn Glick describes it as being purged, and Mike Cernovich, among others, has followed up and said that this is indeed the case. And the spin they're putting on it is that that H.R. McMaster is purging out Israel hawks within the administration, people who take a hardline pro-Israel stance as well as a hardline stance against the Iranian nuclear deal. And of course, she's portraying this as if it's the most evil thing that anybody could possibly do. So that is the development here, and the spin that's being put on it is that McMaster is the globalist McMaster, the puppet of the Soros types, is harming Israel by getting its most ardent advocates within the administration out of the administration. That's the spin that's being put on it. But this is something that's been months in the making here. We speculated among ourselves that perhaps General Flynn was removed, and the official story is because he didn't properly give details of phone calls with specific Russian government figures. But we have among ourselves speculated that perhaps this was a power play of some sort by people who were trying to keep tensions from once again being heightened with Iran as a result of breaking up the nuclear deal, which is clearly what Michael Flynn was in there to do. Is within 2 weeks of the inauguration, he was already making speeches warning Iran that they're on notice for their bellicosity and their insubordination with regards to obeying what was outlined in the nuclear deal. So I think that this is a continuation of a battle that's going on, and it also, I mean, at first glance, and I'm not positive on this, but we could be wrong and there could be other factors at play. Obviously, there probably are. But I think that this really fits that a lot of this evidence is going along with some of the theory that we've outlined, where there really does seem to be a war between where Trump was elected as a result of these hardline Zionist figures within the Breitbart, WorldNet Daily, kind of this patriot hard right community that has always been, that's had an inroads with the Project for a New American Century crowd via Frank Gaffney and also John Bolton, among others, but who have been on the outlying as far as within the Republican establishment. But now over the last couple of years, especially since the rise of Trump, they've made their way into the mainstream of the party and within the administration, where probably these figures have more of a voice, at least since within the Reagan administration. But now they're back and they're really pushing a hardline, seems to be a Zionist hardline policy in conjunction with the hardline right-wing nationalist policy at home, and really does appear to be pushback from forces within what you have identified, Jeremy, as the DC consensus, which is very much, of course, supportive of Israel and the idea of the Jewish state and of maintaining its security, but is also not does not put Israel above all else when it comes to issues related to foreign policy. That's what it appears to be, to me at least, what's going on here with this McMaster at war with Bannon's people, if this is true. And I am inclined to believe that there's probably a lot of truth to this.
It seems like that. And and it's so McMaster, it's so interesting watching McMaster being defined as like this hardcore anti-Zionist, or but it is the case that it looks like he does represent a more what you might call the realist faction of the DC set. And and you can think about that maybe he's not as critical of certain aspects of the U.S.-Israeli relationship as someone like Zbigniew Brzezinski, but he's sort of in that line, it looks like, and then that makes sense also that his focus, McMaster's focus, would be Afghanistan rather than Iran, and of course I believe was the agreement, the post 9/11 agreement between the neoconservatives and the so-called realists over Afghanistan, and of course the Brzezinski set their focus has always been against Russia. So they, in certain ways, they lined up with aspects of the neocons who wanted to see the new Zio-American 21st century be driven from DC, and with Russia as the sort of ultimate long-term new enemy or old new enemy, versus some of these sort of hardline Zionists who have supported Trump, who thought that they had a firm asset in Trump and now are getting disappointed about certain elements of the U.S. military establishment asserting the realist approach. And they'd hoped that they would be able to move the center of power towards Tel Aviv. And it looks like there is some pushback here. Doesn't mean that someone
and eventually Jerusalem, if you listen to those who want that embassy moved so badly.
Right. I think that's not a coincidence that Jerusalem, the moving of the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem was such a key, seen as such a key factor in early Trump administration rhetoric in relationship to Israel. And so there is some interesting stuff about McMaster
and once again, I just want to cut in real quick. Once again, it's appearing to me that if people like Steve Bannon had their way, the embassy would have already been removed, but that there is this element led by folks like McMaster and Tillerson who appear to be pushing back against it. And also another thing that Carolyn Glick claims is that McMaster is the person who decided that Netanyahu would not accompany Trump to the Wailing Wall, which both the hard Zionist wing within the Trump administration as well as the Israeli government were looking at as a huge symbolic gesture. So
yeah, so that is a big deal. So what you see is, it's, to me, and this may have been a sort of a theatrical fraud at some level during the Obama administration, but I think there was actually some real movement between the first 4 years Obama and the second 4 years Obama. And we've referred before that to Obama having this long-term background as a sort of son of the CIA back to his family in Kansas, and then his time in Chicago, where he sort of got taken up as an asset of the Zionist crew in Chicago, including the Pritzkers and those folks. And then Rahm Emanuel being his his first chief of staff, and then him sort of letting him go at some point, and then this key moment in the second Obama administration of the Ghouta false flag in Syria, where there was a move by aspects of sort of the neoconservatives in relationship to on-the-ground Israeli operatives, and sort of some alliance with Turkey and Saudi Arabia in attempting to escalate the operation in Syria. And in the midst of that, there was this sort of old line realist set within the Pentagon and within the intelligence community, where it was Martin Dempsey who made key moves to stand down an attack on Syria at the time by Obama. So that there's a sense of that going on in relationship to Trump, where Trump is an asset, and we've identified all along that he's not a steady asset. There's certain parts of his personality that make him an uneven asset, and so in the midst of this, Trump is also supposedly saying that he does not want his own Iraq, meaning he's not okay with an approach to Iran that's going to create a big war where he's now going to be seen as in a bad light. And at the same time, he got into the race with being against the Iran deal. And so that's still on the table, and that seems to mark who he originally owed in all of this in many ways. So there's an interesting tension right now. And of course, InfoWars and Mike Cernovich and the new mainstream alt-right media, not meaning alt-right, but the alternative right media, is in the midst of this, somehow always lining up with the Israeli interest.
Jeremy, it's the alt-light. So
yes, okay. So I guess that's sort of my take on McMaster.
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly what's going on, but I mean, it is amazing watching these alt-right, not just the alt-right people who are openly pro-Israel and pro-everything Zionist, but it's fascinating watching these alt-right people play mental gymnastics with what's going on, where they're just all about condemning McMaster, but when it comes to the fact that it's the Bannon and the MAGA crew that are the ones that are like the most frothing at the mouth about how terrible this Iran deal and how it needs to be torn up. They really seem to play mental gymnastics with trying to justify in their minds why this might not be the case, or pointing the finger at other people, or just not even pointing it out at all. And why do I get the feeling that whatever happens with Iran, if something does go down, that ultimately those type of people just end up blaming Jared Kushner anyway? I mean, that seems to be where they'll probably go with it anyway. But I just had to make that observation. But it's I do want to say, though, people get this knee-jerk reaction. I want to warn people against getting into like this knee-jerk idea that because even if they see McMaster as pushing back against the hard Zionist wing, don't get any delusions that this is somehow preferable. It's like the Trump people who have been fooled into believing that this Bannon, like hardcore Clash of Civilizations crew, represented by people like Sebastian Gorka, is better than what than the DC consensus foreign policy establishment in regards to shaping foreign policy. So a lot of people unfortunately are trapped into that mindset, and that unfortunately doesn't seem to be changing. But I'd also warn people against getting into any type of knee-jerk response that somehow this McMaster crew is any better, when we know full well what people like General McMaster represent. So I would warn against that. And the other interesting thing about this whole deal is we really don't know what the end game is. Unlike with Iraq, I don't know if there's actually a Breitbart doctrine or any type of like doctrine that has been created as far as like what the actual end game is for Iran. If that's out there, it'd be great if somebody would maybe send it to us or link it to us or comment about it, because I don't know if there's any sort of actual doctrine regarding what the end game is that this Bannon, Breitbart, MAGA wing of the Trump administration has in mind for Iran. And I know that Brendon O'Connell has been putting out a lot of very serious information regarding some of the issues regarding Iran and the rules, many elements of the power structure in Iran and their connections to the CIA and to Western intelligence, Western banking, going back to at least to the 1979 revolution, and brought up all kinds of information about Press TV and how Press TV appears to be a controlled entity, and how really criticism of Zionism is not as widespread and as I guess as prevalent as it's been made out to be within certain elements of that we here in the West have been led to believe it is in Iran. There's actually a lot more censorship. These are things that Brendon O'Connell has put out in some of his in raising some very important questions about what's actually going on in Iran. But I think on the surface, when you look at it, it does appear that there are different factions at play, perhaps in Iran, much like in other parts of the world, as we've identified here in the West, and obviously in regards to Russia policy, there does appear to be different factions at play in Iran. But what seems to be represented, what we can look at on the surface, and like what we can see based on the writings and the sentiments and the positions taken by sites such as Breitbart and WorldNet Daily, Front Page Magazine of David Horowitz, which has a lot of influence with certain people in the administration. What we can see with them is that it does appear, at least on the surface, they're definitely pushing a hardline stance on Iran, which would point towards their goal apparently being regime change of some type, or at the very least keeping Iran from developing any of these types of weapons at all costs. So while I think that Brendon, we definitely need to analyze his work, and it's extremely valuable, whereas I think he's making the argument that a lot of what we're seeing with Iran is theater, and that Iran is just a puppet for a way to scare people, like to continue to justify the existence of a military-industrial complex and all of this defense spending. But I do think that at least what we're hearing here from the Trump administration regarding the actual stated rhetoric and the stated positions of a lot of these elements that are close to Trump and the hardline stance that they've taken, where I think that much like on Israel, domestic politics within Israel, they make the traditional, what you've identified as the paleocons, represented by the Weekly Standard and National Review and some of these other old line
The paleo
neocons, my apologies, the old line of the neoconservative movement look very dovish when it comes to Iran and when it comes to domestic policy in Israel. So while there's definitely some different power plays involved with this whole thing with Iran, I think at the very least, when you have the combination of all of this hardcore rhetoric against Iran and how this deal needs to be destroyed at all costs, ripped up, and then you've got the combination of that with the 1-2 punch of the alternative media, the quote alternative media, being 100% in the Trump MAGA Bannon camp when it comes to both domestic and foreign policy. And you also look at the key role of somebody like a Jerome Corsi, who has been one of the biggest Iran propagandists within the entire DC community, serving as the press correspondent for InfoWars, which at this point it probably is, other than Breitbart, the most influential of all of these quote alternative media outlets at this point. I think we've got to look, at least on the surface, and it does appear that we're on the potential path to some major issues with Iran and also North Korea. It must be added that these same people are the ones that seem to be the most adamant about doing something about the North Korean problem. So we take these things into consideration here, and we'll just have to try to make sense of it as best we can. But at the very least, people need to understand that what this crew represented by the Breitbart Steve Bannon crowd is advocating for foreign policy is not what we need. It's not non-interventionist, and it's not based on principle, and it doesn't just stop with Jared Kushner and the globalist Jews, whatever you want to call them. So
yes, so this relationship with Iran is one of the most torqued and complex in terms of the long-term relationship with the United States and what's the role of Israel in all of this. And so there's a lot there, because it's clear that there's some aspect of the global war of terror and some of the tension, there's a theatrical aspect to a lot of this, where the continuing move towards a technocratic a tyranny continues on, no matter what the different factions are. That of course is related to part of the Talpiot program and the idea of setting up basically a global Jewish state-dominated tech sector that basically is a global Samson option at some level, while also being a surveillance grid. And what the relationship between aspects of the deep U.S. state is to that is sort of in the background. But there is on the surface, there are different factions in relationship to Iran, and even though Alex Jones and the crew would want to portray this as the biggest crisis moment ever, and the generals are plotting to slit Trump's throat and throw him in a ditch and have the alligators in the swamp eat his heart out, it doesn't really look like that. And it looks like Trump sort of is friendly with McMaster, and this is just what would be seen as a Washington consensus stabilizing force that has reasserted itself in the face of a pretty clear foreign coup of some sort in relationship to Trump as an asset of this. Tel Aviv, Moscow, City of London axis. So there is that. And then if thinking about that, the longer scale of the Cold War and the relationship of the U.S. to the Middle East in relationship to the Cold War, there is this transition of what I believe the neocons sort of see as a mop-up transition from what they call World War III, which was the Cold War, into what they call World War IV, the long war, the war on terror, the 100-Year War. And you see this, of course, in relationship to things like the war on Iraq. And the CIA's relationship with Saddam Hussein was part and parcel of their larger approach to backing strongman leaders that they thought would create a bulwark against the Soviet influence in regions around the world. So and then then throwing in Zionist politics and Israeli politics into the mix is adds another layer to this. So Iran, in many ways, if you go back, everyone knows about the CIA coup in conjunction with aspects of British intelligence in '53 and the overthrow of Mossadegh and the installation of the Shah. But it still looks like it could be like maybe some type of national security secret of some sort that the Bush faction of the CIA was deeply involved in removing the Shah and helping install Khomeini. And that the whole idea of what's been known as the October surprise, where it was put forth that the Bush gang and the CIA had back channels with the Iranians in just delaying the release of the American hostages. And of course, that on the surface, that played a major role in the election between Reagan and Carter. And Carter had pissed off that Bush gang CIA faction. There was in October. Carter had done his own October surprise where he had fired 800 covert operatives that he called the cowboys. He was going to clean up the cowboys in the CIA. So that was the cover, and of course it did help Reagan win and come into power. And of course that was who was his vice president, George H.W. Bush. And then of course there was an assassination attempt.
I wanted to say it's interesting you mentioned this, because what you're mentioning here is that there's a precedent. This sets a precedent for wars and battles within what we call the deep state. And now the narrative is, of course, is that the entire deep state's out to get Donald Trump, and we've identified that's not the case. There's actually elemental infighting, much like I think went on within the Carter administration and the intelligence community. But it's funny. I don't think you're gonna hear a lot of these Trump MAGA apologists saying that because Carter was targeted by elements within the deep state that somehow made him like the sworn enemy of all things related to deep state. Yet Trump is. So I just needed to point that out and put that in there. And by the way, the very same people who are now supporting Trump would probably be the ones who took the most hardline stance against Jimmy Carter some 35 years ago. So,
yeah, and there is a sort of parallel, I think, too, in terms of look at Jimmy Carter's antagonistic relationship with Israel in recent years. So obviously he represented a more hostile element, and maybe not hostile, but pushing back against full-on Israeli domination of American politics.
It's funny how that always happens when there's Likud leaders in power too.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And so then thinking about this as I'm not sure exactly what the stance of Israel in terms of the Iranian Revolution actually is. Because, of course, we see Iran-Contra, and Israel played a key covert role in Iran-Contra, and being a middleman to elements of Iran in relationship to CIA covert operations. But I can also see that the sort of the Cold War politics that drove aspects of the justification for the Bush gang's installation of Khomeini, there may be some blowback, what you may actually sort of properly define as foreign policy blowback in relationship to some of the harder line Islamic revolutionaries in Iran, and that Israel would not be comfortable with that. And I've speculated before that there is some sort of outlying obligation or sense that Israel is calling for that blowback to be cleaned up by elements of the U.S. national security state. And I imagine there's different approaches to how to do that. But there's this interesting article that goes deeper into it's called the Real Iran Hostage Crisis, a CIA Covert Op by Harry Martin. And it's from the mid-90s. It's been reprinted in Global Research more in the last years. But it does a very good description of how it actually went down, and how it was not only the October surprise was not only the waiting to release the American hostages, but it was actually the architecture of the so-called crisis itself, the hostage crisis itself. Now, obviously, that is a deeply treasonous fact, if that's the case. That would be a deeply held secret of the U.S. national security apparatus. And also, you can see how there's some type of mutual compromise that results from that in relationship to the Iranian government up into the modern day, even if there are elements of the Iranian Islamic Revolution that have sort of gotten out of the control of the original mandate that they were given as a sort of counter set to the Soviets by elements of the U.S. national security set. So that's all in the mix here, and of course the elements that Brendon O'Connell has identified in terms of the Rafsanjani set, they were in the mix through this entire period in operation. So there's a lot to be uncovered there and to be analyzed in relationship to how much of this tension with Iran is theater. What are the different factions' approaches to Iran? For those that see there to be something to be so-called cleaned up in Iran, are they really about some type of major military assault? That was what was being talked about on the surface during the Bush years, and there appeared to be steps taken towards some type of false flag operation that would initiate some type of nuclear attack, bunker buster attack on parts of Iran at the time. That was then looked to have been stood down and rooted out to some extent. But then there was also, and I believe this was, of course, under the Obama years, right, the so-called Green Revolution, where it was going to be the color revolution and regime change in a fashion like that. And, of course, you could see that there would be the consensus between the hardline right-wing Likud Israeli neocons and the sort of the Washington set that's represented by McMaster is that they'd be much happier, I'm sure, with just a stable neoliberal government in Iran, unless this is theater in a large part, and that Iran is playing the role of a boogeyman that is needed in order to justify further ramping up of security investment, security deals, these types of things.
Yes, indeed, and I really think that people really need to be paying a lot of attention to what the details that Brendon is bringing out about Iran and his analysis, and even with regards to how he's broken down that Iran really doesn't seem to be suffering as much as a lot of people would think they are under the sanctions, unlike what Iraq went through in the 90s and Libya's gone through in recent years. So that's an interesting point from him. But I do think that at the very least, it is vitally important to understand that this whole precedent of wanting to rip apart this Iran deal is not rooted in any type of principle, and that it's definitely a troublesome trend we see rising here. But I'd say that a lot of this confusion could be avoided, or at the very least would not be as, I think it would be much easier to break through if there wasn't this mistaken belief that there is like some type of major like foreign policy consensus where all parties are in agreement on certain matters, or where there's certain issues where all parties march in lockstep on and agree on unanimously. I don't think that's really the case. I'd say Venezuela, there might be an example of where a lot of the foreign policy consensus seems to be pretty much in agreement, but I'm sure there's even differences there. But the fact is that there are differences. You can go back to how the Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, is said to have opposed elements of the Arab Spring, including the removal of Mubarak, Hosni Mubarak, who was seen as an ally of the Israelis, but who those many of the forces behind the Arab Spring desired to, I guess, see removed from power, thus Egypt being targeted in the Arab Spring. So these differences exist, they're very real, and they cannot be overlooked. And it's vitally important to understand these differences, because I think these differences can do a lot to, at the very least, lessen some of the confusion regarding a lot of these policies and who's behind them and who's driving them. And so we're going to be revisiting this topic, no question, here in the near future, I'm sure, as more developments continue to arise in this whole deal. But
one last thing on the Iran thing is that in the beginning of this, people should go look at this article about the real Iranian hostage crisis, a CIA covert op.
We'll link to it in the episode description.
In the opening description, it talks about why Rafsanjani had been trying to move toward the West, and why Reagan called him a, quote, moderate, and why during the Gulf War, James Baker said, "We think Iran has conducted itself in a very, very credible way through this crisis." So that is interesting, and especially in relationship to the 2003 Iraq War and Iran's involvement in getting more influence in the region, and some people saying, well, that's just blowback, that's an unintended negative consequence in terms of the paleo-neocons' eyes. That may be the case, but there may be a whole nother set of relations where that was actually similarly to the way that Afghanistan was the compromise of the realist Brzezinski crowd with the neoconservative Ziocon crowd. That there is some type of compromise or agreement with the elements of Iran in terms of their desire to be more expansive and influential in a larger region. So there may be some type of greater Israel versus greater Persian Empire détente of some sort, or an agreement. I don't know.
It could well be, and that's also where the role of a country like Russia comes into play, in understanding what Russia's motivations may or may not be in the Middle East and in that region of the world. So yeah, these are all very important questions, and we'll definitely be revisiting this topic as more information and more details come out in the near future here. Moving on, I wanted to get into another aspect of this whole Bannon versus McMaster foreign policy fight that's brewing, and that is with regards to Afghanistan. And a lot of the Trump MAGA non-interventionist, technically anti-war types who have supported Donald Trump are hailing Steve Bannon and in his efforts to what they say is going to ultimately perhaps could even bring the conflict in Afghanistan to a close, as opposed to H.R. McMaster, who has been on record saying that urging Trump to put more ground troops into Afghanistan. I want to say, by the way, real quick, an observation with Trump and his personality. We've identified Trump as not being as being very, I think, easily moved. It's much like what Netanyahu said, the Americans can easily be moved. It's like Trump can easily be moved, and when he has one person in his ear telling him one thing, he can easily be swayed by that person. When he has another person in his ear telling him another thing, he can easily be swayed. And so I could see like almost where I think all parties in this whole like infighting with the administration have an understanding, if they can get their people in place to be the ones to influence Trump, that he'll probably go with what they want to go with, if they could sweet talk him enough or smooth talk him enough. So even though Trump obviously was elected by people in this hardline camp when it comes to Israel and Zionism, as well as with Iran. Trump is still very easily influenced by those like McMaster, who, if they have his ear, can really sway him in a certain direction. So I think it's important to understand that too, and in the context of Trump praising McMaster during the New York Times interview. It's like Trump is not out of the water as far as like being in the influence of the so-called globalist faction. It's just that he can, if they can get his ear, they can probably sway him in their direction. So I think that's a fascinating dichotomy to see play out, as how the easily swayed Donald Trump, who doesn't have any real principles on any of this stuff or any real policy direction on any of this stuff personally, can just so easily be moved by these people. So, but anyway, with regards to Afghanistan, you take a closer look at what Bannon is advocating, and also Jared Kushner. There have been a couple of very good articles written about about this, and what Bannon and Kushner are both representing is or advocating for is a switch from military on-the-ground presence in Afghanistan to more of a private mercenary, private contractor type of policy for Afghanistan, with people like Steve Feinberg of Cerberus, which oversees Dyncorp. So he technically is the head of Dyncorp, as well as Erik, the Blackwater mercenary from the Iraq War days. And it seems that what they want to do is they're bringing people into the administration to lobby for a turnover of Afghanistan to private contractors rather than a military presence on the ground. But I think it's very important to make the case, to lay out and to that this is not going to result in an end of the Afghan conflict, unlike what some of Trump's more apologists for the Trump MAGA agenda, someone like, say, for example, Justin Raimondo, who should be up to date on this stuff, considering the American Conservative, which he's very close to, has actually published a very in-depth piece about this whole deal. That they're wrong in saying that somehow what the Bannon crowd is pushing is going to somehow be an end of hostilities in Afghanistan. Actually would be the exact opposite. It just appears to be an emergency way to continue the conflict and perpetuate it.
Yes, this goes to the core of the fraudulent nature of the populism that's actually been brought in by Donald Trump. Because there were two key acronyms that Donald Trump's critical relationship towards it during the campaign indicated that he was some type of real nationalist populist. And of course, those two are NATO and NAFTA. And it's starting to look like, and I'd hypothesized this during the campaign in relationship to Trump's alleged anti-NATO stance, that part of it was that although Trump is he's anti-ground troop interventionist potentially, because it's an unpopular thing to do now in where we are in American history, which is a very good thing, and we need to keep that up and escalate that general sentiment. But he's not a non-interventionist. There's been escalations of not only the rhetoric but the actual ground approach to intervention in Afghanistan, whether it's the Moab or it's the escalation of drone strikes in Yemen and that type of thing. There was an aspect where Trump's so-called NATO approach was really the large portions of the 7 countries in 5 years approach, I think, is what Wesley Clark typified it as by the neocons in post 9/11 world. Although they took them a little bit longer, they were well on their way there. And so the large-scale military interventions have already been...
And it should be noted that Trump is doing absolutely nothing to change this policy.
Yeah, and so then the sort of what it is NATO then is seen as a global homeland security. So transitioning from similar to our conversation about Iran, as representing a sort of a question about the Cold War mop-up still hanging in the breach, that transitioning NATO from a World War III Cold War perspective to a World War IV long war, global war on terrorism perspective, and turning it into a global homeland security apparatus that basically just helps stage false flag terrorism throughout Europe and then responds supposedly in some way. That does look like what the aspects of the Trump administration are about. And so similarly, the sort of the anti-NAFTA aspect of the alleged nationalist populism is starting to be seen as a sort of a Trump pump and dump operation. Alex Jones' main thing that he brags about what Donald Trump has done is that the stock market has surged. Alex Jones used to at least mouth aspects of economic populism that didn't only affect like the top, whatever percent of people in the country that the stock market represents. And of course,
hey, when Alex wants to find something to criticize Trump about, he just can't because he's just so good.
He's too good. He's so good that I don't trust him. And so there is this aspect that we see that yes, Trump is he's a sort of almost like a punctuated equilibrium move by neoliberal sort of corporatists. It's maybe nationalism at some level, but not really when you see the actual the city of London to Russia, back to Tel Aviv aspects of some of the billionaires that Trump is in tight bed with and is apparently boosting their economic situations. So there is this sort of corporatist approach to the so-called nationalist populist agenda here that is very well represented by a push towards turning Afghanistan, getting it out of the hands of the nasty U.S. military who, no matter how many war crimes they've committed, they still have an oath that they took, and there's still a sense of that this belongs to a constitutional chain of command and back to the American people at some level, but into the hands of the Dyncorps and the Blackwater now academies, and basically a long-term corporatist driven war in Afghanistan. And so is that really that's sort of our two policy choices here is between the McMaster endless occupation by American forces and the Bannon Feinberg Dyncorp approach in Afghanistan? No.
Endless occupation by private contractors.
Yes, and so, but this does I believe explicate this situation at some level, that this is about who's going to make the money in terms of these long wars, and where is the chain of command, and is it going to be encumbered by nasty things like oaths to the Constitution?
Yeah, you're right. And I have a feeling that even though this is a very serious policy dispute, I have a feeling that both sides will end up like scratching each other's backs at the end of the day when it comes to these policies. And I'm sure they'll both find a way to profit, but just I think that one wants to just have just have control over it. And but it's interesting to see play out. But the other thing we got to remember is that you kept mentioning that the purpose of this Trump, a lot of these Trump people, is to perpetuate false flags, and not just to blame terrorism, but to blame Islam in general, which I think is the number one way to perpetuate a war on terror, which leads to a clash of civilizations, is to continue to blame Muslims for all of this and blame Islam in general for all that we're seeing happening. But the thing that we have to remember is no matter how much lip service they pay to non-interventionism, how much lip service they pay to not getting involved in more foreign conflicts, and as I've said, could be outlined by someone like Sebastian Gorka with his, him making the rounds with what we identified as perhaps maybe the neocon 2.0 doctrine of just only going into places when it serves our interest and no nation building. If and when there's an event of another major false flag style attack in the United States, these people are not going to come. These people are not going to be. They're not going to be against going after whoever is said to have been responsible for it. So we have to remember this, and that could very well be the end game with the Trump administration. We'll have to wait and see, like we do with all of this. One last topic, though, that I wanted to get into, I found really interesting. I've been looking to do this for a while, and I finally got a chance to. I was at a local library the other day, and I got a chance to, I'd say, read about the first third or so of Roger Stone's book on Donald Trump, The Making of the President 2016, how Donald Trump orchestrated a political revolution. And in the first third of the book, there wasn't a ton of new information that really stood out to me. I mean, for example, it's interesting to see Roger Stone, some of the people in the acknowledgement section, Stephen K. Bannon, Jerome Corsi, but also Stone mentioned did confirm that the rationale for Trump's initial refugee ban in December 2015, which immediately followed the San Bernardino attack, was a study by Frank Gaffney's Center for Security Policy linking refugees to terrorism. So that was confirmed by Roger Stone in his book. And also he confirmed made the statement that he could be of much more of a, and you've identified him as saying this already, but that he could be of much more of a service to the Trump administration outside of the administration than from within, and particularly by serving as a liaison for alternative media. And we see what Stone did for him almost within a couple of months of being out of the administration. He was the one who booked Trump's appearance with Alex Jones, which I think really was very much a key to, was probably the key moment in getting like the alternative media behind Trump and all of the patriot base behind Trump. I think that was probably the key moment. But the thing that was most interesting in the first third or so of this book was Roger Stone detailing Donald Trump's almost run for presidency in 2000 with the Reform Party. And Roger Stone goes into details about how Trump was really beginning to consider it. He had the big primetime interview with Larry King on CNN where he announced that he was considering a run for president, getting all types of media coverage going all around the country and making big speeches and stuff and grandstanding. And but in the process of this, Trump, as I said, was running with the Reform Party. The Reform Party was the party of Ross Perot in '96. And also Pat Buchanan had just recently left the Republican Party and had joined the Reform Party and was pegged to be their candidate, their nominee for president in 2000. And so one of the major things Trump did in the process of this major media campaign where he was grandstanding about running for president was he was going after Pat Buchanan. And this is real ironic considering his the most recent election, some of the things Trump was accused of. But he was calling Buchanan a Nazi apologist and enabler of anti-Semitism, among other things, because of some of the things Buchanan had written about World War II not being as a conflict that could have been avoided. And Stone, in talking about Trump's near run for president, ended up saying that, well, Trump decided that he may not have the public support to do it, so he decided against it because he only wanted to run if he won. And I can believe that, by the way. But also Stone lays out that Trump basically worked to split the Reform Party and to divide the Reform Party. It goes into a Reform Party convention where Trump is on stage right in front of all the Reform Party people saying that I don't know what their policy, what their platform is. Nobody knows. And that caused a big uproar. And it just appears that Trump played the role of just fracturing a party that, while Buchanan was not a legitimate threat to Bush and winning the presidency in 2000, it does appear that this was an attempt perhaps to weaken the party so that it took fewer of the votes than it would have taken otherwise. And when you consider Roger Stone's history, you have to really take that into consideration. I mean, this is the man who helped put the campaign to get Al Sharpton to run in 2004 with the Democrats as an attempt to weaken the left prior to the 2004 election to make re-election for George W. Bush easier. So this raises the question, is this indeed what happened with Roger Stone and Donald Trump? Was there a campaign, a coordinated campaign to weaken the Reform Party? I think this has to be asked considering Donald Trump's history and Roger Stone's history in particular. And also Stone positively mentioned the role of Jesse Ventura in this fracturing of the Reform Party. So raises a lot of questions here. What do you think?
Yes, I think this is an important American political history to begin to understand, because yeah, it makes a lot of sense that if there were an operation to install Bush in 2000, that part of the way to do that would be in a destabilizing, fracturing the most potential third party threat. And this also then speaks to what is this Trump operation, and of course these key figures such as Jerome Corsi and Roger Stone, they are now the sort of the key elders in the Alex Jones InfoWars operation. And their role, very specifically, as the sort of maybe some of the key operatives that we see working in terms of the George W. Bush operation, with Stone playing a key role in terms of the staged what was that thing, the
Brooks Brothers
the Brooks Brothers riot, right? And then also Corsi's key role in leading the Swift boat veteran attack on Kerry in 2004 that was then backed up by pretty clear election fraud.
It does appear that the roads do lead back to the Council for National Policy with a lot of this too. So
that is very interesting. So I think this is an interesting piece of history to understand and to sort of see these black bag political operators such as Roger Stone and Jerome Corsi, and seeing how clear it is that they then were repitched in terms of a sort of, if you think about psychographical warfare. And this really is not a moot point. This needs to be dealt with, the increasing effect of psychographical warfare and the reframing in a psychopolitical way of some of these figures, that Corsi and Stone are supposedly the tiny bit of lip service that Alex Jones gave to his audience in justifying why these black bag operators who helped put in George W. Bush, you remember the neocon asset who helped, it was there for 9/11 and then the subsequent escalation of all these wars, why these guys who were key to that installation operation are now somehow with the Patriots. And he said Roger Stone, felt bad about his role in that, and Corsi, I don't even remember any justification. And then we see Jerome Corsi is getting text messages from the highest levels of Israeli intelligence live on air with InfoWars, and Roger Stone goes from working inside the Trump campaign to some type of sort of faux breakup to then very quickly being taken up in a smooth way. Once again, I will say,
if you want a reason to worry about the possible end game for Iran, think about the fact that Jerome Corsi's in there as the press correspondent.
Yes, and so in a certain way, maybe the tension between the realist faction and this, it could be that what's really going on with the rooting out of Watnick Cohen is basically the realist camp of H.R. McMaster being like, we can't have straight up Israeli agents on the National Security Council. They used to have to sort of play it behind the scenes and, have Rahm Emanuel playing the role of chief of staff and this type of thing. And we can't have straight up Israeli agents on the National Security Council. So it may just be something as simple as that, and that the U.S. national security immune system is not completely gone in that way. Not that those are the good guys, but
right. I think it's more of a pushback, where it's the consensus that is just like that supports Israel, supports Jewish state, keeping it, maintaining it, but not down with the more hardline policies. I think this is something that's played out a lot longer than just recently, but is really just becoming a very public spat within the last year or so. And I think this would have happened regardless of who won this election. So anyhow, we got any closing thoughts before we close up here?
Let's just stay focused and dig deep and figure out what we're up to as a people. So thank you very much, Greg.
All right, for sure. Yeah, and let's just remember that that there is definitely no lockstep. I think that there's definitely a lot of daylight, and there's not a whole there's not just a cabal of people behind the scenes who just all agree on everything related to foreign policy. And I think that's a vitally important thing to understand. But we're going to keep an eye on this Iran stuff and what's going on with the leaks and McMaster and whoever else, and we'll just try to report as best as we can on it. So anyways, until next time, we'll talk to you soon.